Today is Wednesday, June 14th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When I went to college as an 18-year-old, I enrolled as a pre-med student and majored in biology. I was a Christian just making my way into Christianity. And as a science major, I was immersed in many ideas that I had no means of evaluating. I had no way to tell if the things that I was learning in my biology and chemistry classes were true. And I often felt confused and frustrated because I just had no way to discern what I should think on these different issues. And as I continued as a pre-med student, the lessons just got more and more controversial, more and more complex, and I didn't feel that I had any tools to help me discern these issues in, let's say, medical ethics, or in teaching about biology and the broader philosophical implications about of some of the teachings. That's actually what led me to change my plans for my life, change my studies, and focus instead on classical studies and ancient history. I realized that I was getting into a field, getting into an occupation that I wasn't spiritually or philosophically prepared to enter into. And now, as a 48-year-old classicist, I look back and I thank God for those decisions I made, because they were actually decisions that were wiser than I understood them to be. I was simply acting based on how I felt as a Christian. But now in hindsight, I realize that I saved myself from a number of errors, or rather I was saved from a number of errors which could have had very negative influences in my life. And my study of classical philosophy and Christian teaching and over the last 18 years, Catholic teaching really helped me to avoid what I now understand to be pretty significant errors with lots of moral and philosophical and religious implications. I'd like to take some time today to talk about the theory of evolution and why I think it's important for Christians to reject the theory of evolution. And I want to make it understood that I'm not ignorant of the arguments for evolution in modern academia. Like I said, I was a pre-med student. I understand the natural sciences. I'm able to read journal articles. I'm able to read books and things like that on subjects in the natural sciences and understand them easily. But I positively reject the theory of evolution for what I think are pretty important reasons. And I would like to address some of the things that I hear when I talk about the subject of evolution with other Catholics, because in my personal judgment, and this talk is just that, it's my personal judgment, which I'd like to share. I think that there are things said by Catholics about evolution that are false. And I'd like to identify some of those things, and I'd like to explain why I am convinced that they're false. The purpose of this talk is, I hope to, or I honestly intend to move forward discussions, at least among people that I interact with, on the topic of evolution, so we can avoid statements about what the church teaches and what popes have taught that are actually not true and are never verified in these conversations. One of the things that I can't stand about modern discussion is how many people pull quotes from internet articles or websites without ever reading the sources that those quotes are taken from. They literally pretend to have read encyclicals, speeches, books, and so on, that they have simply seen lines quoted from, and they copy and paste those lines with no knowledge of the context or full message that was shared. And I'd like to point out a couple of these things and just talk about the subject of evolution in some more detail than normal, and explain clearly, I think, why I believe that Christians have to reject the theory of evolution. And before I get started, let me just say, I understand that there are going to be Catholics who listen to this and disagree, and I'm cool with that. What I ask, though, is that you raise specific objections. If I say something you disagree with or you think is false, specifically object to that point and show me where you believe something I've said is false. I really don't want comments on the videos that are just judgments. Most of the feedback I get is either positive, which I really don't care about, or it's just negative judgment like, you're an idiot, this is stupid, your arguments are terrible. Those are not real responses, and I don't take any of them seriously. If there's a specific objection, then make it, because I'd like to get into those specific points of discussion. I'm not denying that I may get something wrong or may draw a conclusion that isn't exactly valid. I understand that. That's the whole nature of discussion. That's the purpose of discussion is, as the Proverbs say, iron sharpens iron. By sharing things, we make ourselves vulnerable for the sake of becoming stronger. No one should enter into a discussion pretending like they've got everything figured out, or we'd never enter into any discussions. We enter into discussion understanding that we're working with rough drafts on these issues, and by putting our ideas out and by inviting feedback that's actually objective and reasonable and not just judgmental and useless, we can begin a back and forth discussion that actually helps both sides of the discussion to become clearer and more exact in our thoughts and actually progress together so that we can enjoy like-mindedness because we've worked through this issue together. That's the real purpose of discussion, and that's the reason why I make these talks and publish them. I'm not pontificating. I'm not speaking from any authority. I'm simply sharing the present state of my thoughts on these topics, and my real desire is that they would lead to some discussion back and forth, whether between me and someone listening or just between people who are listening. So receive this talk as it's intended to be received, and spare me the useless judgments in the comments, because I don't pay attention to them at all. Now, it's very common for Catholics to say that the Church has approved the theory of evolution. It's very common for Catholics to say that recent popes, like Pope John Paul II or Pope Benedict XVI or Pope Francis, have embraced the theory of evolution. And first of all, I would argue that that is completely false. I think I can make a case to prove that the popes have not in any way embraced the theory of evolution in modern scientific circles. The reason why that statement is even made and spread around is because quotes are pulled from things that have been spoken and written by these popes, and the quotes are posted without any context and they're consequently misread and misinterpreted by people who use them. And I think I can prove that these quotes are misread. Now, this is just a casual talk, so I'm not going. This isn't a scholarly article. I'm not going to give detailed references and things like that. I'll simply refer to some of the works, some of the authors, where these ideas and words come from. And if you want to trace them out with exact references, just ask in the comments, and I'll give you links to documents and things like that. But for the sake of the discussion, I'm not going to get into all of the details of references and things like that. But I can assure you that I'm not copying and pasting quotes from works that I didn't take the time to read from beginning to end and read carefully to make sure that I understood the message that was shared. So my first argument, my objection to this common talk about the theory of evolution among Catholics, is that the popes have not supported the theory of evolution. Popes have not embraced it or approved of it as if it's scientific fact. And I'd like to explain why I say this. The things that have been said by popes have been said in a specific context, the context of the reality of modern society. The popes are not speaking things that they've spoken or written in a vacuum. They're speaking in an existing context of modern culture. And the things that they've said can only be understood when they're considered in that context. And I'll give you an example to illustrate this. Imagine if my daughter came to me and said, "Dad, is it all right if I go on a date with Tommy?" "Dad, is it all right if I go on a date with Tommy?" And I respond to my daughter and say, "Sure. You are free to go out with Tommy to Mass on Sunday. You're free to go on a date with Tommy at church. You can go to Mass on Sunday." And then imagine if my sons, overhearing the discussion, said, "Daddy told Mary that she can go on a date with Tommy." Think about the problems with this situation. My daughter is asking if she can go on a date because she already knows that I don't want her going on dates, so she's asking for permission to go on a date. If it was okay, she would just make the arrangements and go. She's asking for permission because she already knows that she doesn't have permission to go on a date. My response to her is not affirmative. I'm sure that her and Tommy were not planning to go to Mass together. I'm sure they were not asking me if it's okay that they go to church. They probably would want to go out bowling or to a movie or to get something to eat or something like that. And so my answer, even though it is spoken with affirmative language, is not an affirmative answer. I say, "Sure, you can go on a date with Tommy to church. You can go to Mass together." Now, knowing the intention of the question, one can understand the significance of my response. Because Mary and Tommy are not asking if they can go to Mass on Sunday, my answer to them is actually no. And yet it's spoken in affirmative language. My sons, overhearing the conversation, who turn around and suggest that I gave an affirmative answer, are actually not thinking of the answer in context of the actual question and discussion. And this is what happens in this use, this pulling quotes from the speeches and writings of popes that appear to be favorable with respect to evolution. And I'd like to explain this even further, because this is something that the popes do on a number of subjects in modern society, and I believe that it's a rhetorical strategy that the church has used to enable it to interact with modern culture in a unique way, in a positive way. Let me explain this, because it's a little complicated, but I think once I explain it, you're going to see that it actually does make sense of what's going on, not only on the question of evolution, but on other questions as well. And so I'll give another example to further illustrate this. If we ask the church today in the 21st century, is it possible for a Muslim to be saved? We would expect the church to use the expression that was used throughout much of church history and say something like, outside the church, there is no salvation. Outside the church, there is no salvation. Now that sounds very exclusive, because salvation is exclusive. But the church has a responsibility to engage positively with our modern society. And the church chooses to change the way that it answers that question without changing the answer to the question. And this is a subtle rhetorical shift that I think is actually quite brilliant, that the church has made use of. And what the church does is answer in what appears to be an affirmative way. When asked, can a Muslim be saved? The church says, well, actually, yes. A Muslim could be saved, and this is all hypothetical. Yes, a Muslim could hypothetically be saved if, and these are the conditions, if that Muslim is ignorant of the gospel through no fault of his own, and if he has followed the promptings of his conscience in all matters. Such a Muslim who meets these criteria could, in God's mercy, be saved. That's the church's answer in the 21st century to the question, can a Muslim be saved? Now, many Catholics throw a tantrum when they read this answer or hear this answer, because they feel, like my sons did in the other illustration I gave, they feel that the church is giving an affirmative answer to a question that should be answered negatively. But the church isn't doing so. The church is answering the question in a clever rhetorical way that pushes the question back on the Muslim and forces the Muslim to actually answer the question about whether he can be saved or not. So the church says, well, these are the criteria, and I suppose that if these criteria were present in a particular Muslim man, then it wouldn't be reasonable to say that such a man would be worthy of condemnation and eternal punishment. So why don't you go ask the Muslim if he meets these two criteria? Now, the Muslim's answer to the questions determine whether he can or can't be saved. And you see how all of the pressure has been shifted from the church and the hierarchy of the church onto the individual. So the Muslim is asked, okay, Mr. Muslim, have you made every effort in your power to learn the Christian gospel? And if you are ignorant of the gospel, is it true that that ignorance is in no way your own fault, because you've made every attempt to learn the gospel? Now, I don't think that any Muslim living would answer, yes, I have made every effort possible in my life to learn the Christian gospel. And as soon as the Muslim answered, no, I have not made every effort to learn the gospel, and my ignorance of it is partially my fault. He would condemn himself. Likewise, if he was asked, have you perfectly followed the promptings of your conscience in all areas of life? There's no Muslim who honestly would say, yes, I have perfectly submitted to the promptings of my conscience throughout my life. And so the Muslim would condemn himself by responding to questions about the criteria which the Church gives under which a Muslim might be saved. Now, knowing that no Muslim is going to answer these questions affirmatively, the Church answers the question whether a Muslim can be saved in a way that appears to be affirmative, but in reality is negative. Because there's not going to be an individual Muslim who says, yes, I'm ignorant of the gospel, though I've made every effort to know it, and I've always followed the promptings of my conscience perfectly. So what appears to be an affirmative answer is, in its context, in the real context of real life, negative. And this is what the Church has done with respect to evolution. And I'd like to explain this further, so just stay with me. The theory of evolution, let's establish the context of this discussion. The theory of evolution was never promoted at any point among the approved classical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. It was never approved by Pythagoras, never taught by Socrates, wasn't embraced by the Stoics, and so on. The doctrine of evolution, or theory of evolution, has never been part of the accepted Western tradition of philosophy. Likewise, the theory of evolution has never been promoted by any fathers or doctors of the Church. Some will object and say that St. Augustine said that we should not read Genesis literally, and they imply that means evolution is acceptable because it doesn't read Genesis literally, but that's not what St. Augustine meant. He wrote a whole book on the interpretation of the book of Genesis, and he clearly taught, as St. Thomas explains in the Summa, that God created the world and all its furnishings, all its species of living things, instantaneously. So rather than saying we should not read Genesis literally, we should understand it in an evolutionary sense, Augustine actually said the opposite. He said we shouldn't understand that God created the world in stages in time, but that he created the world instantaneously by divine power. And that the book of Genesis is simply a means of explaining to man, who is a rational creature, the order of the created world, because to know order is wisdom. And so God was giving man, through the Genesis account of creation, an understanding of the order that was necessary for man to be wise with respect to understanding the order that exists in the created world. That was Augustine's position on creation. So he wasn't suggesting that we shouldn't read it like a Protestant creationist would read it. We should read it in an evolutionary way instead. He was saying we shouldn't read it as the Protestant creationist reads it. We should understand the explanation to be philosophical or theological, but we should understand that God created the world by his infinite power through an instantaneous creation of all things according to their species. So Augustine was not an evolutionist, nor was he open to evolutionary thought. No one in the history of the Church ever proposed this theory of evolution. And that's important to understand the context of anything that's spoken or written by the church on evolution in modern times. We know that the theory of evolution was promoted and popularized by Charles Darwin. And the book through which it was popularized, many of us are familiar with. It's The Origin of Species. I believe it was published in 1859. So, middle of the 19th century of the Christian era is where we find the theory of evolution proposed by a non-Catholic naturalist, a material scientist, a biologist. Evolutionary theory was never proposed by a Catholic, and the men who proposed it were what are called materialists. They're men who believe that there is a material or physical explanation for everything that's perceived in the world. They deny the existence of any spiritual substances, anything that exists invisibly or immaterially. They deny the existence of God. They deny the existence of angels and demons. They deny the existence of the soul of man as a separable substance that can be separated from the body. They deny that God creates a soul and that this soul is joined to a body to form a human person. They deny all of that. The theory of evolution provides a strictly materialistic and biological explanation for the origin of man and for most or all modern species of animals. That has to be understood as the context in which any statement by the church on evolution is made. The people who believed, the people who promoted and developed the idea of evolution were materialists. They were modern natural scientists. They did not believe in the existence of spiritual anything, and they were promoting a strictly material or biological explanation of the origin of man. That's the whole point of the theory of evolution. If you go to the encyclical Humani Generis, written by Pope Pius XII, and note that this was written in 1950, so about a century after Darwin's Origin of Species. This is not some medieval encyclical. This was written in 1950 by Pope Pius XII, and he speaks about this theory of evolution and talks about the reason why it's being promoted in modern society. And he explains that there is a philosophical agenda behind the promotion of the theory of evolution. He explains this in Humani Generis. He says in paragraph number 5, and I'm reading this, so follow me along. I'll read it twice so you have a chance to hear it once and then listen to it more carefully the second time. Pope Pius XII writes, "If anyone examines the state of affairs outside the Christian fold, he will easily discover the principal trends that not a few learned men are following." So there's a stream of thought existing in this 20th century. Some men, and listen to this carefully, some imprudently and indiscreetly hold that evolution, which has not been fully proved, even in the domain of natural sciences, explains the origin of all things, and audaciously support the monistic and pantheistic opinion that the world is in continual evolution. Communists gladly subscribe to this opinion, so that when the souls of men have been deprived of every idea of a personal God, they may more efficaciously defend and propagate their dialectical materialism. I'm going to read that again because it's very important, and it really explains in 1950 how the papacy viewed the theory of evolution. Listen again. If anyone examines the state of affairs outside the Christian fold, he will easily discover the principal trends that not a few learned men are following. Some imprudently and indiscreetly hold that evolution, which has not been fully proved even in the domain of natural sciences, explains the origin of all things, and audaciously support the monistic and pantheistic opinion that the world is in continual evolution. Communists gladly subscribe to this opinion, so that when the souls of men have been deprived of every idea of a personal God, they may the more efficaciously defend and propagate their dialectical materialism. This is how the papacy viewed the theory of evolution in 1950. He goes on to say this. I want to quote one more passage. Such fictitious tenets of evolution, which repudiate all that is absolute, firm, and immutable, have paved the way for the new erroneous philosophy which, rivaling idealism, immanentism, and pragmatism, has assumed the name of existentialism, since it concerns itself only with existence of individual things and neglects all consideration of their immutable essences. Now that's a mouthful of philosophical language, and most modern Christians have no idea what Pope Pius XII is talking about here, because the philosophical system and educational system that existed before this time is not known today by students, by Catholics who have been raised in a modern educational system that did not avoid these errors, but rather followed them and submitted to them. And so I'm going to explain what Pope Pius XII says here. Pope Pius says there is a philosophical cause or motive behind the promotion of the theory of evolution in modern society. It has never been held at any time in Christian history. The motive is to pave the way. I believe he actually used that phrase, pave the way. He said to efficaciously defend and propagate their materialism. So the philosophical idea that's being pushed is materialism, the idea that all that exists is what is material, that matter is all that exists, and any explanation of the origin of anything must be strictly material. He goes on to say even further that the philosophical system called existentialism is also promoting the theory of evolution. And then he talks about what existentialism is, and I want to explain this because, like I said, for Catholics who did not grow up studying Aristotle's reasoning or Aristotle's philosophy or scholastic philosophy, they won't know what this is even talking about, because it's assuming an understanding of Aristotelian ideas that aren't understood by most readers. And it's worth noting that this encyclical was addressed to archbishops and bishops. It wasn't addressed to lay people. So it's assumed that the leaders of the church would understand what's being said and referred to here, whereas lay people don't understand it. What he says is, existentialism concerns itself only with the existence of individual things and neglects all consideration of their immutable essences. If we go back to ancient philosophy, if we go back past Aristotle, past Plato, all the way back to Pythagoras, we find that Pythagoras taught in his philosophy that wisdom was the pursuit, or I should say, wisdom was the knowledge of what he called real things. Wisdom is the knowledge of real things. There's a great explanation of this in the opening lesson of our classical arithmetic course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Wisdom is the knowledge of real things, and Pythagoras goes on to explain that real things are things which do not change. Real things are things that last as they are forever. Those are real things, and things that change, those are not real things. A wise man is a man who knows the real things. Now, we have to ask, what are these real things? And he goes on to explain that the real things are attributes that are predicated of different substances. Attributes that are predicated of different substances, or predicables, to use a philosophical term. Now, there are two kinds of substances that we learn about in classical reasoning, and this is not too heavy, so even if you've never studied this, just bear with me, because it's not too difficult to understand. And if you want to really get into this and study it, study the Classical Reasoning 1 course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. That's where we learn this. Substances are things that are able to exist in the mind by themselves. Substances are things that are able to exist in the mind by themselves. They don't need to be present in something else in order to have existence. So, for example, the color blue cannot exist in the mind by itself. There must be some subject or substance which possesses the quality of blueness. The same thing is true with something like quantity, like the number 7. 7 cannot exist by itself in the mind. There must be 7 somethings. 7 must be predicated of some substance. And so there are substances and there are attributes. And even when we look at substances, there are two different kinds of substances. There are primary substances and secondary substances. Primary substances are the most proper and true substances because they actually exist on their own, not only in the mind, but also outside the mind, in the world. So they're called primary substances because they're able to exist on their own in both senses, in the mind as ideas, but also in the world as actual living things. I shouldn't say living things, as actual things in existence in the world. So we've got primary substances, and then secondary substances are ideas that can exist by themselves in our minds, but do not actually exist outside the mind in the world. And I'll give some examples to make this clear. It's not difficult to understand if you just follow along. So there are primary substances and secondary substances. An example of a primary substance is you the individual. So me, for example, I am William Charles Michael. I am a primary substance. I exist as an individual. I can exist both in the mind and outside the mind. I'm a primary substance. You can actually observe me. I happen to be a physical body, so you can observe me with the senses in the physical world. I am a primary substance. I exist in the physical world. But I want to be careful here because the natural world also includes spiritual things. So don't think like a materialist and think that only material things exist in the natural world. Immaterial things also exist in the natural world, and this is the crucial issue. I'm said to be a primary substance because I exist in the natural world. not just in the mind. And I can be observed by means of the senses. That makes me not only existing in the natural world, but I'm also existing materially in the natural world. I'm a primary substance. However, I belong to a class of creatures, and the class is called man. So I am a man. I belong to a class of creatures, and all human beings belong to that class. The class, however, does not actually exist outside the mind. It's a classification. It's a genus that exists in the mind. It doesn't actually exist in any way outside the mind. This is Aristotelian philosophy. Plato disagreed, and Plato argued that the idea of man actually does exist in the created world outside of the mind of man. But Aristotle rejects that, and scholastic tradition takes Aristotle's position. The predicate man, or the class man, exists in the mind. I can go on further and say that I am also an animal. So not only am I a man, which is one class, but man belongs to a higher class called animal. And so my essence, what I actually am, is a rational animal. That's what man is. Man, I am a rational animal. Now, in classical philosophy, it's this knowledge of the essences of things, the knowledge of the essence of things, which is the whole goal of philosophy. And this is the real things that Pythagoras was talking about. We seek to understand the true essences of things. We seek to understand what things truly are. And this is the idea that's explained in Aristotle's categories, this whole system of what are called predicates that are divided into different classes, different categories. And the truth of philosophy begins with understanding the 10 categories of things that can be predicated of subjects, some of which are substances, some of which are attributes. Now, again, I know that's a lot of philosophy. And what's good about talking about it is now you know what you don't know. So if you'd like to get into this more, like I said, study Classical Reasoning 1 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and you can get into this and learn it. Now, this is what Pope Pius XII is taking for granted as he talks here in this encyclical. He's assuming that his audience knows what he's talking about when he talks about existentialism as a modern anti-Catholic philosophy. Listen again to his description of existentialism. Existentialism concerns itself only with the existence of individual things, that is, primary substances. Existentialism concerns itself only with the existence of individual things and neglects all consideration of their immutable, unchanging essences. Existentialism concerns itself only with existence of individual things, primary substances, and neglects all consideration of their immutable essences. This philosophy is the source of the evolutionary theory. This new philosophy is what's really behind this, and I'll explain how it works. In reasoning, we learn that whatever can be said of a class of things, whatever can be said truly of a class of things, can be said truly of each member of that class. So, for example, if I say that all men are mortal, and you identify as a man, you are a man, then I can conclude by reason that you are mortal. You've identified yourself as a member of the class man, And it's not identify yourself in this crazy modern sense where you can identify as a bird or as a woman. You are identified by your actual essence as a man. And therefore, anything that can be asserted universally of the class man can be asserted individually of you. And the same is true of animal, and so on. So reason, when we learn the essences of things, and we learn these different classes to which things belong, and the attributes that belong to those classes, we can then reason and draw conclusions about all individuals in those classes. And that's how philosophy works. We seek to know the classes and the attributes of the classes so that we can then draw conclusions about individuals. And that's what it means to be wise, to be able to draw true conclusions about an individual thing based on your knowledge of the attributes of the class or classes to which that thing belongs. That's what classical philosophy is. That's how Aristotelian philosophy works. Now, when we just reject any notion of classes or secondary substances, we just reject and ignore all of that, and we suggest that only primary substances exist. What happens is we cannot reason about any primary substances. We cannot reason about any individual things that exist in the world. And so all reason and Aristotelian or scholastic philosophy is banished from truth-seeking because we can't draw conclusions, because we can't identify individuals as belonging to classes of things. The modern sciences do not study what Pythagoras and the ancient philosophers considered to be wisdom. They concern themselves only with the existence of individual things and neglect all consideration of their unchanging essences, which are known by their definitions, which depend on the existence or knowledge of classes and the attributes of classes to which individual things belong. So all scholastic philosophy is destroyed by this idea of existentialism, and what Pope Pius XII is warning is that this is what's behind this promotion of evolutionary theory. It separates individuals from all other members of any class. So if I look at 10 men, I'm not able to draw any conclusions because we understand that the only thing that exists is this individual person and that individual person, and they don't necessarily have any connection. Now, as Christians, we struggle to even comprehend how anybody can think like that. But now, if you look at what's going on in modern society and how people think and talk, you can see how this is all related. Why can an individual person identify, for example, as a different gender? And if you say, you're not a woman, you're a man, you have the they'll immediately cut you off and deny that any notion of some unchanging essence of any individual thing, any class that a thing may be said to belong to, they deny that there's any such class in reality. That's what they're saying. So when you say you're a man, you have the essential qualities of a man, they simply deny that is even true. There's no such thing. I am an individual evolving thing. There is nothing else like me, and therefore I can predicate of myself whatever I please. I'm accountable to no class. I'm accountable to no definition. I can identify as anything I want. And it's just going to be wackier and wackier as time goes on. That's the consequence of this way of thinking. That you don't know me. You can't make any judgments about me. I may have my whole body tattooed, and I may have my nose pierced, and I may have my hair dyed blue, and I may, be foul-mouthed, and I may be using drugs and drunk half the time, but you can't make any conclusions about me because I am an individual, and the only thing that exists are individual things. I don't belong to any class. And this is how we're taught to think. We're taught and told by this modern society that we are not allowed to make any rational conclusions about any individuals by assuming that they belong to some class, and that what can be asserted of that class can be asserted of them as individuals. We're told that that's racism, for example. There are no classes. There are only individuals. And therefore, if you're walking on a dark street in the middle of the night and some guy is walking up the sidewalk towards you and he's dressed like a gangster, you're racist if you assume that you should walk to the other side of the street. Because you need to judge the individual based only on your experience with the individual. And you will never find out whether that individual is bad or not until he stabs you in the face. And this is what we see. This is why we want to defund police in modern society. This is why cops get criticized for so-called racial profiling, where they know what to look for based on the qualities of classes of criminals, and therefore they preemptively try to identify criminals by things they know to look for, and they're criticized for this because they're drawing conclusions based on experience, based on class attributes, and they're told that this is not allowed, that this is racist or prejudiced, when it's actually reasonable. So this philosophy that we see dominating modern society, which is being driven by the natural sciences, because they're not innocent investigations of what God has created. They're a radical alternative means of supposedly seeking truth that rejects and disallows scholastic philosophy, which existed before the advent of this modern scientific worldview, I can say. Pope Pius XII was warning about this in 1950, that this is what's really behind evolutionary theory. And he goes on at the end of this document. We get to the bottom of this document. Listen carefully. This is paragraph 36 of Humani Generis. After giving, many other reasons he talks about in this document, he says, for these reasons, the teaching authority of the Church does not forbid that in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields, that is, in the natural sciences or human sciences and in sacred theology, research and discussions may take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution. So the Church says, if you want to explore this idea in research and in discussions between human scientists and theologians, you may do so. We're not going to crack down on this and say it may not even be considered in research. You're free to do that. But they establish limitations. He says the Church does not forbid in as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that the souls are immediately created by God. So the Church allows scientific research and discussion among, quote-unquote, men experienced in both fields. Not among the laity, not in schools, but in a research, investigative context. The church says, we are not going to say you cannot explore this theory, but what we are going to say is even if you do, it must be done under these restrictions. Now, the reason why this is so important, and to get back to what I was talking about earlier, this is what appears to be an affirmative answer, but it is in fact a negative answer. It appears that the church says, yes, it's okay to hold the theory of evolution, but that is not what the church actually says. Pope Pius XII here has already explained what men are saying and how they're using the theory of evolution. He's already explained that it's to promote materialism and existentialism. He's already established that context, and so now he's saying, in answer to the question, may we explore the theory of evolution, his answer is yes. You may explore the theory of evolution in or under these restrictions. It applies only to the human body, and you must confess that the human soul was created by God, immediately created by God. So there's your answer to the question. And the answer to the question is, as I showed before with the Muslim question and with the dating question, the answer to the question is a question for the individual to answer himself and judge himself. So now we take this to the person who's talking about evolution. First of all, if it's a layperson, the talk of evolution shouldn't even be in their mouth, because this is addressed to scientists and theologians. So there's no layperson who has any justification to be talking about evolution. The church doesn't recommend that at all, and I'm going to show that further in just a minute. Hopefully I'll remember. The church is talking here to scientists and theologians who are discussing this in the context of research. It establishes these criteria. We've already been told that the people promoting the theory of evolution do not submit to these criteria. So the question is pushed back upon them. So if you would like to explore the theory of evolution, are you willing to commit to considering the theory of evolution only so far as it applies to the human's physical body? If yes, then we can go on. So you're saying that the physical body of man is being considered as to whether it evolved or not. If you're willing to limit your statement to the body of man, then you can proceed. But you also must accept criterion number 2, which is you will confess that the soul of man was immediately created by God. Now, will the materialists grant that second point? No. So their theory of evolution is rejected as incompatible with the teaching of the church. How about the existentialists? Will they grant this second condition? No. Therefore, their talk and use of the theory of evolution is also judged to be incompatible with church teaching. So what we have here is some imaginary evolutionist, because I don't believe that this person exists, just like I don't believe a Muslim exists who has sought to know the gospel and has lived perfectly according to the dictates of his conscience. I believe that these answers are rhetorical. I don't believe there's anyone who is seriously persuaded of the theory of evolution and is exploring it, knowing that in the end he's going to have to confess the immediate creation of the soul by God anyway. The soul, after all, is the more is the superior part of man, and so the man would have to confess the divine creation of the superior part of man in order to argue that the inferior part of man was not also immediately created, but evolved over millions of years through this long, drawn-out process, which has a billion problems with plausibility, which I haven't even gotten into. What evolutionist has ever proposed this idea that we're only talking about the body of man while also confessing the immediate and divine creation of the soul of man? There's no one proposing evolution as a theory to explain the creation of only the body of man, where man is actually a creature composed of body and soul, made to the image and likeness of God. The theory of evolution was born in a context of materialism, of atheism, of existentialism. That's where the idea of evolution came from. I would even argue that if you go back into ancient philosophy, it's found present in Epicureanism, which was rejected by the great Western philosophers. In the context, the actual context of the discussion of evolution, we have materialist scientists and existentialist philosophers promoting evolution as a means of turning man into nothing more than an individual whose origin and existence can be explained with nothing other than biological ideas and explanations, all physical, all material, all subject to human senses, and that there's nothing more to man than can be found in a frog or in a tree or in a plant. And this is the idea in modern society. It's why you can watch individual people physically mutilate and destroy their bodies and wonder how they could do that. But it's because you can't comprehend the mind of a person who imagines that he or she, or it, whatever it is an evolved individual creature that has no relation to any other individual creatures, but is completely independent of any class or group, has no definition, self-identifies however it pleases, and so you can't comprehend that mind, because hopefully by God's grace you've been protected from it in modern society. But this is what is ultimately promoted through evolution, and I don't believe, and this is where I could be wrong and you could raise an objection, I don't believe that there were, in 1950 or today, any evolutionists who are seriously proposing the idea that man's body evolved from pre-existent matter, but God immediately created his soul, and that's how man was made. Because there are obvious, I would hope obvious, problems with that argument. For example, there would have to be an entire race of pre-rational, soulless human animals that look like humans, skinless apes, the bodies of humans with no souls. And God would have had to choose one of those creatures and given it a soul and caused it to become a rational creature, and that would have distinguished that individual from the existing class of creatures that had human-like bodies with no souls. There's no one who proposes any such thing. So you just see that this attempt to if someone does claim that that's what they're saying, I just don't believe that they ever get examined by anyone and are made to give an account for the implications of this silly idea that they propose. Where did the soulless humans go? And if you can't provide any evidence of the existence of any soulless human beings, then this can never advance beyond mere theory. In fact, I would argue that the theory of evolution is really no different from the mythology that we see in Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's mythology. There's no demonstrative scientific evidence, and by the time you actually get someone to compose a detailed explanation of what would have had to take place for the evolution of man's body to then be given a soul at a certain point of time, you would have written a mythological story that looks like something out of the Metamorphoses. And no one's even willing to take it that far. Because in a modern science context, you're usually in an academic environment. The students don't care. They just are looking for grades and credits to get degrees and licenses and jobs. And that's why these theorists get away with these totally implausible theories that they're never required to give an account for in terms of what the actual message would be in order for their supposed explanation to have actually occurred in history. So does the church allow men to explore the theory of evolution, or does it crack down on it like the Spanish Inquisition? No, it's free to scientists and theologians. They are free to explore this idea. But they do so under the restriction that they must confess the immediate creation of the human soul, which no one interested in evolution has any interest in doing. So again, I think it's a rhetorical device that, in answer to the question, pushes the question to the individual and says, you hold these 2 points, right? And when the person says no, they condemn themselves. And so it's a clever response that has an appearance of sort of a positive, friendly dialogue, if you will. It seems positive until you consider the context and realize it's not at all positive. The restrictions exclude almost everyone, if not everyone. Now, before I mentioned, and I remembered here, before I mentioned that lay people, seminarians, school students, school teachers, and so on, are not even supposed to be talking about evolution. And so the discussion itself should only exist among scientists and theologians in the context of research, not in the classroom, not in conferences, not in lectures, not in books, not in schools, not at the family dinner table. And this is said explicitly by Pope Pius XII at the end of this document. Pope Pius XII says, and this is in paragraph 41, towards the end, for this reason, after mature reflection and consideration before God, that we may not be wanting in our sacred duty, listen to this, we charge the bishops and superior generals of religious orders, binding them most seriously in conscience, to take most diligent care that such opinions be not advanced in schools, in conferences, or in writings of any kind, and that they be not taught in any manner whatsoever to the clergy or the faithful. I'll read that again. With respect to this theory of evolution, Pope Pius XII in 1950 said, after mature reflection and consideration before God, we charge the bishops and superiors general of the religious orders, binding them most seriously in conscience, to take most diligent care that such opinions be not advanced in schools, in conferences, or in writings of any kind, and that they be not taught in any manner whatsoever to the clergy or to the faithful. Now, how in the world would anyone read this document published at Rome in 1950 and say that the church has embraced evolution? Now, in future talks, because we're already over an hour here, in future talks I'm going to get into this and go further. But Humani Generis clearly makes it known that the church, if you read it, not if you pull one line out of it that you see on the internet and copy and paste it every time somebody mentions it, if you actually read the whole document, you'll see that the church says exactly the opposite of what anyone suggests the church has said. There's no approval of evolution. Even where it's granted that the discussion of evolution may go on in research contexts, it's required to go on with restrictions that I would argue no one is interested in accepting. No one who's interested in the question of evolution in the first place would be eager to acknowledge the direct creation of the soul by God in man. And so I believe that that's a rhetorical response that leaves the individual researcher to answer the question, and he's going to disqualify himself by his answer. But even more importantly, at the end of the document, Pope Pius XII forbids the clergy or faithful to be taught the ideas that are present in the theory of evolution or the ideas that relate to it. So, what are we even talking about? What are we even talking about? Now, this was published, as I said, in 1950. A lot's happened since then. And to get into the more modern popes, like Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, we're going to move forward. But what I want you to see, as of 1950, the Church forbid the casual teaching or discussion of the theory of evolution and revealed very clearly the philosophical ideas that were behind it, that evolution was being brought into academic circles like a Trojan horse for the advancement of philosophical ideas that were anti-Catholic. So I'm out of time here. I don't want to go much longer, but I'm going to stop there. I hope that was helpful. I intend to continue this subject in subsequent talks. So if you're interested and find this helpful, keep an eye out for talks to follow. If there's anything that I've said, and I say this sincerely, if there's anything that I've said that you think is unjust or exaggerated or not accurate, based on this document, Humani Generis, let me know. I'd be happy to look into any objections that you might have. Keep an eye on the comments, and you'll see the kind of junk that I normally get. It's usually just arrogant dismissal of the whole message, personal attacks, and so on. I don't pay any attention to that. If you've got something that you'd like to object to, then identify it and put it on the table so we can look into it, because you might be right, and that would be fine. But at least be honest and objective in disagreeing so we can make some progress and have a useful discussion. I hope that's helpful. God bless.